the millionaire cruelly abandoned his beloved. 25 years later, he was paralyzed when he saw her with a young man identical to him in a luxury restaurant. He approached. Ethan Walker sat at an elegantly set table in one of New York's most renowned restaurants, surrounded by business executives with whom he was on the verge of sealing a major deal. The conversations around him were lively, filled with talk of profits, market shares, and strategies, but his mind was elsewhere. Years of climbing the corporate ladder had turned Ethan into a man of steel, someone who could close deals without emotion or hesitation. Yet, tonight, something felt off, a strange unease he couldn't quite shake. The soft hum of classical music filled the air, blending with the clinking of glasses and the murmurs of the high society patrons around him. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze wandering past the faces at his table and over to the other diners in the restaurant. That's when he saw her. At first, it was just a glimpse, a familiar silhouette, a turn of the head that sent a jolt of recognition through his body. His heart skipped a beat. His eyes narrowed as he tried to convince himself that it couldn't be her. But as she moved further into the room, stepping out of the shadows and into the soft, golden light of the chandelier, there was no mistaking it. Danielle. She was just as beautiful as he remembered, if not more so. Time had been kind to her. Her dark hair, pulled back in an elegant twist, shone under the light, and she moved with the same grace that had once captivated him. Ethan felt his throat tighten. After all these years, after all the choices he had made, she was here in the same restaurant, in the same city, at the same moment. His mind raced, trying to process how this could be happening. 25 years. 25 long years since he had last seen her, since he had made the decision that would change both their lives forever. He had chosen his career over her, believing that love was a distraction he couldn't afford. And now, here she was, like a ghost from the past, walking back into his life when he least expected it. But then, something else caught his attention. She wasn't alone. A young man, tall and strikingly familiar, followed close behind her. He looked to be in his early 20s, and there was something about him that made Ethan's chest tighten even further. The young man's face was sharp, with features that mirrored Ethan's own from decades ago. It was like looking into a reflection of his younger self. Ethan's pulse quickened as he watched them approach a table nearby, settling into their seats with an ease that suggested this was a regular outing for them. Who was this young man, and why did he look so much like Ethan had at that age? Ethan found it impossible to focus on the meeting at his table. The voices around him faded into a dull buzz as he kept glancing at Danielle and the young man across the room. His mind filled with questions that seemed to have no easy answers. He excused himself from the conversation, feigning the need for a quick break, and rose from his seat. As he walked toward Danielle's table, his heart pounded in his chest. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he was finally close enough, he stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. Danielle had noticed him now. Her eyes widened in shock, and for a brief moment, their gazes locked. There was no warmth, no spark of the affection they had once shared. Instead, her expression was guarded, as if she had built walls around herself, and Ethan was an unwelcome intruder. "Danielle," Ethan finally said, his voice barely audible. She blinked, recovering from her initial surprise, and nodded curtly. "Ethan." Her voice was as familiar as ever, but it carried a coldness he had not anticipated. The young man beside her looked up, curious, but said nothing. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off him. "Who is this?" Ethan asked, gesturing slightly toward the young man. Danielle hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching Ethan's face as if weighing how much to tell him. Finally, she spoke, her words landing like a blow he hadn't expected. "This is Dylan," she said, her tone steady but distant. "My son." Ethan's world seemed to tilt, the ground slipping from beneath him as the weight of her words sank in. "My son." His breath caught in his throat as he looked from Danielle to Dylan, his mind racing to connect the dots. The resemblance, the timing, the way Danielle had looked at him. Dylan wasn't just her son. He was Ethan's son, too. Ethan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. His son. He had a son. For a moment, the world around him faded into the background. The soft chatter of the restaurant, the clinking of silverware, even the weight of Danielle's gaze. It all disappeared as he focused solely on the young man sitting before him. Dylan. His son. How is this possible? Ethan finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. He was still trying to wrap his head around the reality of the situation. He felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet, leaving him unsure of how to stand. Danielle's face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Anger, perhaps, or pain. It was hard to tell. She sat up straighter, her hands resting on the table, and met Ethan's gaze with a cold, unwavering stare. "You left, Ethan," she said, her voice calm but laced with the weight of years of unspoken hurt. "You walked away from us, from me." The accusation hung heavy in the air, but Ethan could barely comprehend it. His eyes darted to Dylan, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and indifference, as though this moment meant nothing to him. For Ethan, it was everything. "I didn't know," Ethan said, shaking his head, his voice full of disbelief. "I had no idea. Why didn't you tell me?" Danielle let out a soft, bitter laugh, one that cut through Ethan's heart like a knife. "Tell you," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "You were too busy building your empire. There was no room in your life for a family." Ethan flinched at the truth in her words. He had chosen his career over everything else, believing that success would fill the void inside him. But standing there, facing Danielle and the son he never knew existed, he realized how wrong he had been. I made a mistake," Ethan admitted, his voice faltering. "I didn't know you were pregnant. If I had known, You would have done what, Ethan?" Danielle interrupted, her tone sharp. "You would have dropped everything, stayed with me? I don't believe that for a second. You made your choice a long time ago." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling a deep sense of regret settle in his chest. He had spent years chasing success, believing that nothing else mattered. But now, as he stood in front of the family he had unknowingly abandoned, he realized how much he had lost. "I didn't choose to leave you," Ethan said, trying to defend himself. I thought I was doing what was best for both of us. I thought you'd be better off without me." Danielle's expression softened for a moment, but only for a brief second. "Better off?" she repeated, shaking her head in disbelief. "You don't get to decide that, Ethan. You never did." Dylan, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. His voice was calm, but there was a clear edge to his words. "I don't need a father," he said, looking directly at Ethan for the first time. "I never did." Ethan felt as though he had been punched in the gut. Dylan's words were a cold reminder of the years that had passed, the time he had missed. He had no idea who Dylan was, what kind of man he had grown up to be, and the realization hit him hard. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Ethan said, turning his attention to Dylan. "I don't even expect you to understand. But I'm here now, and I want to make things right." Dylan leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest, a skeptical look on his face. "Make things right," he repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You think you can just show up after all these years and everything will magically be fine?" Ethan shook his head. "No," he admitted. "I know it's not that simple. But I want to try. I want to get to know you." Danielle looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of her wine glass. "It's not that easy, Ethan," she said softly. "You can't just waltz back into our lives after all this time and expect things to go back to the way they were." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she was saying. "I don't expect that," he said. "I know I can't change the past, but maybe we can start over. Maybe I can be a part of your lives now." Dylan's expression didn't change, "I don't need you in my life," he said bluntly. "I've gotten by just fine without you." Ethan's heart sank. He wanted to argue, to convince Dylan that he could make up for lost time, but deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. He had been absent for far too long, and no amount of words could change that. Danielle looked up, her eyes meeting Ethan's once again. "I don't know if we can ever be what we were," she said quietly. "But if you really want to try, it's going to take time." Ethan nodded, feeling a mix of hope and fear rising in his chest. Time was something he had plenty of now, but he wasn't sure if it would be enough to fix what had been broken. Ethan sat back down at his own table, his mind racing. The words Danielle and Dylan had said echoed in his head like a never-ending loop. "You left us. You chose your career. I don't need you." The weight of their accusations felt like bricks piled on his chest. He had spent so many years focused on success, and now, with everything he had built, he realized that it had come at an unimaginable cost. The deal being discussed at his table continued, but Ethan couldn't focus. The excited talk of profits and expansion sounded hollow. For the first time in his life, business wasn't his priority. "I need a moment," he muttered to his colleagues, rising quickly from his seat. Outside the restaurant, the cool night air hit him hard, but it did nothing to clear the storm of thoughts in his mind. How had he not known? How could Danielle have kept something like this from him? He pulled his phone from his pocket, staring at the screen, debating whether or not to call her. But what would he even say? That he was sorry? Sorry wouldn't be enough. He walked a few paces down the street, the sounds of New York City buzzing around him. But it felt distant, just background noise to the whirlwind of emotions crashing inside him. He had always told himself that leaving Danielle was the right decision, that focusing on his career was the only way to ensure success. But now, seeing her again, with Dylan by her side, he felt a gut-wrenching regret that gnawed at his soul. How different would things have been if he had stayed, if he had chosen her? He would have been a father. Dylan would have grown up knowing him, and maybe, just maybe, they would have been a family. Instead, he had abandoned them both, without even knowing it. Ethan shook his head, trying to rid himself of the thoughts, but they wouldn't go away. He was a man who prided himself on being in control, on making decisions that led to success. But this was a decision he had no control over, and the thought of it made him feel lost in a way he hadn't felt in years. He leaned against the brick wall of the building and closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe deeply. He needed to face this. He needed to figure out how to fix it, even though he wasn't sure if it could be fixed at all. "I want to make things right," he had told Dylan. But how? Dylan had grown up without him, and it was clear from the coldness in his eyes that he had no interest in getting to know the man who had abandoned him. And Danielle. Ethan wasn't sure where to begin with her. There was so much left unsaid between them, years of emotions buried under layers of bitterness and hurt. A taxi passed by, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan thought about jumping in and disappearing into the night. Running away had always been his solution, hadn't it? But he knew he couldn't do that this time. He had run once, and it had cost him everything. Now, he had to stay. He had to face the consequences of his choices, no matter how painful. With a sigh, Ethan turned and walked back into the restaurant. His colleagues shot him curious glances, but he ignored them, taking his seat quietly. The meeting wrapped up, deals were finalized, and congratulations were exchanged. But Ethan's heart wasn't in it. As the evening came to an end, Ethan found himself once again glancing toward the table where Danielle and Dylan had sat. They were gone. He felt a pang of disappointment, as if he had lost an opportunity he hadn't even realized he wanted. He stepped outside again, this time to hail a cab. His thoughts were still in turmoil, and the streets of New York, usually a source of energy for him, felt overwhelming. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, half expecting to see a message from one of his business partners. But it wasn't. It was from Danielle. His heart raced as he opened the message, a simple text that felt like a lifeline. "We need to talk. Tomorrow at noon. same place. Ethan stared at the screen for a long time, his mind filled with a mixture of relief and anxiety. She hadn't shut him out completely. There was still a chance to fix things. At least, that's what he hoped. The next morning was a blur of routine. Ethan went through the motions, attending meetings, answering calls, but his mind was fixed on the meeting he would have with Danielle. Noon couldn't come fast enough. When he arrived at the restaurant, he found Danielle sitting at the same table, alone this time. She looked calm, but there was an undeniable tension in her posture. Ethan approached cautiously, unsure of what to expect. As he sat down, Danielle didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "You asked why I didn't tell you," she said, her voice steady but laced with underlying pain. "The truth is, I didn't think you cared." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but she held up her hand. "You made it clear when you left," she continued. "You wanted your career more than anything. I didn't want to burden you with something you clearly didn't want." Ethan sat back, feeling the weight of her words sink in. It was true. He had left without looking back, without giving her a chance to explain. He had assumed that walking away was the best thing for both of them. But now, he saw how wrong he had been. "I was wrong," Ethan said quietly. "I see that now, but I want to make it right. Please, Danielle, let me try." Danielle's eyes softened for a moment, but the hardness quickly returned. "You have a long way to go, Ethan," she said softly. "This isn't something you can fix overnight." Ethan nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He wasn't sure if he could fix things, but for the first time in years, he knew he had to try. That night, Ethan returned to his penthouse in Manhattan, but the usual satisfaction he felt when looking over the glittering city skyline wasn't there. Instead, the panoramic view seemed distant, almost meaningless. He poured himself a drink and sank into the leather armchair by the window, staring out at the city without really seeing it. His thoughts were too tangled in the past and the painful truth he had just learned. Danielle's words echoed in his mind. "You didn't care. You chose your career." He had heard the accusation before, from rivals, from friends who couldn't understand his obsession with success. But hearing it from Danielle, after all these years, felt different. It hit harder. It forced him to confront the life he had built and the sacrifices he had made to get there. Had it been worth it? The question hung heavy in his mind, one he had avoided for so long. Ethan had always justified his decisions. He told himself that the long hours, the late nights, the deals that consumed him were all necessary to reach the top. He had believed that nothing else mattered. Not love, not family, only success. And he had achieved it. He was one of the most powerful men in the country, admired and respected in the business world. But sitting here now, alone in the dark, with the knowledge that he had a son he had never known, Ethan felt that success ring hollow. He thought about Dylan, how his son had looked at him with indifference, maybe even disdain. How could he blame him? Ethan had been absent for his entire life, not by circumstance, but by choice. And Dylan had grown up without ever knowing his father, without knowing that Ethan even existed. Ethan took a long sip of his drink, the burn of the whiskey doing little to ease the ache in his chest. He tried to picture what Dylan's childhood must have been like. What kind of man had he become? Who had been there for him when he needed guidance, when he needed support? Certainly not Ethan. The regret that had begun to surface the night before had now settled deep within him. A constant reminder of the choices he had made. He had been so focused on building his empire that he had neglected the one thing that might have truly mattered: family. A soft chime broke through his thoughts as his phone lit up on the table beside him. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but a small part of him hoped it might be Danielle. It wasn't. Instead, the screen flashed with notifications from his colleagues. The merger he had been working on for months was in its final stages, and his input was needed to push it across the finish line. Usually, this would have been enough to grab Ethan's attention, but now it felt trivial. It was just business. He placed the phone back down and stood up, walking toward the large glass window that stretched from floor to ceiling. Outside, the city was alive, a reflection of the fast-paced world he had always thrived in. But for the first time, Ethan felt disconnected from it. His mind wandered back to the first time he had met Danielle. They were both so young then, full of dreams and ambition. But where she had dreamed of love and a life together, Ethan had only seen obstacles. He had wanted to be the best, to be at the top of his field, and he couldn't afford distractions. At least, that's what he had told himself. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling up inside him. He had been a fool. He had let go of the one person who had truly cared about him, all for a career that now seemed meaningless in comparison. But the worst part, the part that cut the deepest, was that he had missed the chance to be a father. He had missed Dylan's entire life, his first steps, his first words, his school years. All of it. And now, here they were. Strangers bound by blood but nothing else. Could he fix it? Could he find a way to be part of Dylan's life now, after all these years? Ethan didn't know. But he knew one thing. He couldn't walk away this time. Not again. His phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't work. It was Danielle. A brief message flashed on the screen. Dylan isn't ready to talk yet, but I am. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., same place. Ethan exhaled, his shoulders sagging with a mixture of relief and anxiety. At least there was some progress, however small. Danielle was giving him a chance to explain himself, to apologize. But what about Dylan? The coldness in his son's eyes from their brief encounter haunted him. What could he possibly say to change that? What words would make up for years of absence? Ethan set the glass down and walked across the room, pacing as he thought about tomorrow's meeting. He knew he couldn't afford to mess this up. Danielle was the key to reconnecting with Dylan, but even then, it wouldn't be easy. He was a stranger to them now, an outsider looking in on a life that had moved on without him. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt powerless. He had spent years building a legacy, one brick at a time, but now it seemed as though those bricks were crumbling beneath his feet. What good was all his power, all his wealth, if he had no one to share it with? No one who truly mattered. Tomorrow was his chance to start making things right, but the road ahead was unclear. Could he rebuild what had been broken, or had too much time passed, leaving wounds too deep to heal? Ethan didn't have the answers. All he could do now was try. The next day, Ethan arrived at the restaurant early. He couldn't shake the nervous energy running through him. And for the first time in years, he found himself feeling uncertain. He had faced high-stakes negotiations with billion-dollar deals on the line. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was personal. He glanced at the clock. It was only 1:45 p.m., but the minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly. Every time the door opened, he looked up, his heart racing in anticipation, only to feel a wave of disappointment when it wasn't Danielle. His mind kept replaying the moment when she had first revealed the truth to him. Dylan. Their son. The son he never knew existed. When the door finally opened and Danielle walked in, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. She was alone this time, and there was a calmness in her demeanor that contrasted sharply with the tension he was feeling. She spotted him immediately, her expression unreadable, and walked over to the table where he was waiting. "Danielle," he greeted her, standing up as she approached. She gave him a small nod, acknowledging his presence but without the warmth he once knew from her. "Ethan," she replied simply, sitting down across from him. The air between them was heavy, filled with years of unresolved tension, hurt, and regret. Neither of them spoke for a moment, and the silence stretched out, awkward and uncomfortable. "I'm glad you agreed to meet with me," Ethan finally said, trying to break the ice. His voice sounded stiff, even to himself. Danielle nodded again but didn't smile. "We have a lot to talk about," she said, her tone serious. She wasn't here for small talk. She was here for answers, and Ethan knew that. "I know," he said quietly, clasping his hands in front of him on the table. "I've been thinking about everything you said or about Dylan, about the way I left." He paused, searching for the right words. "You're right. I made a huge mistake. I thought I was doing what was best for both of us, but I see now how wrong I was." Danielle's gaze softened slightly, but there was still a guarded look in her eyes. "You didn't even give me a chance, Ethan," she said, her voice laced with pain. "You decided for both of us, and I had to live with that decision, alone." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "I thought I was protecting you," he admitted. "I thought you deserved better than someone who was so focused on his career. I convinced myself that walking away was the best thing for you. But I realize now that I was just running." Danielle didn't respond immediately. She looked down at her hands, which were folded in her lap, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might not say anything at all. But then she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Do you know how hard it was to raise Dylan on my own?" she asked, her eyes lifting to meet his. "To explain to him why his father wasn't there, why he never knew you." Ethan's chest tightened. He could hear the pain in her voice, the years of struggle she had endured without him. He had abandoned her, not just emotionally but physically, and the impact of that decision had rippled through both of their lives in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I never meant for things to be this way." Danielle looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his apology. "Sorry doesn't change the past," she said finally. "It doesn't erase the years you missed. Dylan grew up without a father, Ethan. He doesn't know you and he doesn't need you. Not now." Ethan flinched at her words, but he couldn't argue with the truth in them. He had missed everything. Dylan's childhood, his teenage years, all the milestones that a father should have been there for. He had no right to expect forgiveness, let alone a place in Dylan's life now. "I know I can't change the past," Ethan said slowly, "and I don't expect to. But I want to try, Danielle. I want to be a part of his life if he'll let me. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Danielle sighed, rubbing her temples as if the conversation was exhausting her. "It's not that simple," she said. "Dylan's grown up. He's not a little boy who's waiting for his father to come home. He's a man now, and he's built his own life. You can't just walk in and expect everything to fall into place." "I don't expect that," Ethan replied quickly. "I know it's going to take time. I know I have to earn his trust, and yours." Danielle looked at him, and for the first time since they had sat down, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, maybe hope, maybe doubt. It was hard to tell. "Dylan isn't ready," she said finally. "He's angry, and he has every right to be. But I'm willing to talk. I'm willing to see where this goes." Ethan felt a surge of relief at her words, though he knew this was just the beginning. It was more than he had expected, and for that he was grateful. "Thank you," he said softly. "That's all I'm asking for. A chance." Danielle nodded, though her expression remained cautious. "Just remember, Ethan," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't about you. This is about Dylan. He's the one who's been hurt the most in all of this." Ethan nodded. He understood that now. It wasn't about making himself feel better or easing his own guilt. This was about Dylan, about trying to be the father he had never been. "I know," Ethan said, his voice steady, "and I'm ready to face whatever it takes." Danielle gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod before standing up. "We'll see," she said, her voice trailing off as she turned to leave. "We'll see." After his meeting with Danielle, Ethan returned to his office. but the usual drive and ambition that fueled him had been replaced by something far more heavy: regret. Sitting behind his expansive desk, surrounded by awards, framed magazine covers, and documents that symbolized his success, he felt strangely out of place. For the first time in years, his work didn't matter. The empire he had built seemed small in comparison to the vast emptiness that had grown inside him. He swiveled his chair around, facing the massive windows that overlooked the skyline of Manhattan. The view, once a symbol of everything he had achieved, felt meaningless. It was hard to believe that just days ago, this had been his world: deals, profits, and negotiations. Now, all he could think about was the family he had left behind. Danielle had agreed to talk, but Dylan... Ethan couldn't get the image of his son's cold eyes out of his mind. There was no warmth, no curiosity, just indifference. A stranger. Ethan wanted to connect with him, but he had no idea where to begin. How do you make up for a lifetime of absence? His computer chimed, pulling him out of his thoughts. An email popped up on his screen, a reminder about the merger meeting scheduled for the following morning. Normally, this would have been at the forefront of Ethan's mind. It was a critical deal that could shape the future of his company. But now, the thought of sitting in a boardroom discussing figures and forecasts felt trivial. He closed the email without responding and leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting back to Dylan. What kind of life had he lived? What kind of man had he become? Ethan knew so little about his son, and the more he thought about it, the more it tore at him. He hadn't just missed Dylan's childhood, he had missed everything. Grabbing his phone, Ethan hesitated for a moment before pulling up Danielle's number. He couldn't reach out to Dylan directly, not yet. But maybe Danielle could help him understand more about the son he had never known. His fingers hovered over the call button, but before he could press it, the door to his office opened, and his assistant, Claire, stepped in. "Mr. Walker," she began, her voice polite but concerned. "The board is asking for an update on tomorrow's meeting. They've been trying to reach you." Ethan glanced at her, momentarily caught off guard. For years, Claire had been his right hand, managing his schedule and ensuring that every business matter was handled with precision. But now, even she could sense that something was different. "Tell them I'll handle it tomorrow," Ethan said, waving a hand dismissively. Claire hesitated, clearly surprised by his lack of interest. "Is everything all right?" she asked carefully. Ethan paused, considering her question. For years, he had prided himself on being invulnerable, on never letting anything or anyone interfere with his work. But now, everything felt different. For the first time, the weight of his personal failures was overshadowing his professional success. "I'm fine," he said, though the words felt hollow. Claire didn't push further, sensing that whatever was going on with him was beyond her understanding. "I'll let them know," she said before leaving the office, closing the door behind her. Alone again, Ethan stared at his phone, finally pressing the call button. The phone rang twice before Danielle's voice answered. "Ethan," she said, sounding cautious. "I wasn't sure if you'd answer," he admitted, his voice softer than usual. There was a brief silence on the other end before she replied. "I said I was willing to talk. What is it?" Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to phrase what he wanted to say. "I don't know where to start," he began. "I want to understand Dylan. I don't know anything about him. Danielle. What kind of person is he? What has his life been like?" Danielle sighed, the weight of the years they had spent apart hanging in the air between them. "He's a good kid," she said after a moment. "Smart, independent. He's always had to be." Ethan could hear the unspoken words behind that last sentence, "because you weren't there." He felt a pang of guilt and leaned forward in his chair, resting his elbows on his desk. "I want to get to know him," he said quietly. "I know it's not going to be easy, and I know I don't deserve it, but I want to try." There was another long pause before Danielle responded. "He's not ready," she said bluntly. You saw that for yourself. He's angry, Ethan. He grew up without a father, and now, suddenly, you're back, expecting him to what? Embrace you with open arms? I don't expect that, Ethan said quickly. I don't know what I expect. I just know I want to try. Danielle's voice softened slightly, though there was still a barrier between them. You're going to have to give him time, she said. Dylan's had his own life, his own struggles. He's not going to let you in just because you want it. You left, Ethan. You have to understand that. Ethan closed his eyes, absorbing her words. I know, he whispered. I know I left. I regret it every day. Silence followed, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might hang up. But then Danielle spoke again, her tone more gentle this time. You need to be patient. If you really want to be part of his life, you're going to have to earn it. I will, Ethan promised, his voice steady. Whatever it takes. Danielle didn't respond immediately, but when she did, there was a sliver of hope in her words. We'll see. Ethan hung up the phone, the conversation leaving him both hopeful and apprehensive. Danielle had given him a glimmer of a chance, but Dylan, winning him over would be the real challenge. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, Ethan was ready to fight for something that truly mattered. The next few days passed in a haze for Ethan. He went through the motions of his daily life, meetings, calls, and endless emails, but his mind was elsewhere. Thoughts of Dylan and Danielle consumed him, overshadowing everything else. For so long, he had believed that success was the only thing that mattered. But now, as the days stretched on without a word from Dylan, he felt the hollow ache of loneliness in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit back and wait for Dylan to come around. But what could he do? Every instinct he had honed over decades of building his career told him that he needed a strategy, a plan. But this wasn't a business deal. This was his son. And there was no negotiating the time he had lost. Ethan sat in his office late one evening, staring at the skyline as the city lights blinked on in the distance. Normally, the sight of Manhattan at dusk would fill him with pride, a testament to his achievements. But tonight, it felt empty. All the success in the world couldn't fill the void left by his absence in Dylan's life. As the hours ticked by, Ethan found himself pacing, his thoughts racing. He needed to find a way to show Dylan that he was serious, that he wasn't just going to disappear again. But how? An apology wasn't enough. Words weren't enough. Finally, he made a decision. It was risky, but he didn't see another option. He needed to talk to Dylan face to face, yet without Danielle acting as a buffer. He needed to show his son that he was vulnerable, that he was willing to be honest, brutally honest about his mistakes. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing outside Dylan's apartment building. He had gotten the address from Danielle after a long conversation the night before, and now, here he was, standing on the sidewalk, feeling more nervous than he had in years. It felt strange, almost surreal, to be so close to his son's life, yet still so far away. Taking a deep breath, Ethan walked up to the building's entrance and pressed the buzzer for Dylan's apartment. He wasn't sure if Dylan would even answer, but he had to try. After a few moments, there was a crackling sound as the intercom came to life. Who is it? Dylan's voice sounded distant, and Ethan could hear the suspicion in his tone. It's me, Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of everything he wanted to say. Your father. There was a long pause, and Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. For a moment, he thought Dylan might hang up, might not even let him in. But then, with a loud click, the door unlocked. Ethan stepped inside, making his way to the elevator with a mixture of anticipation and dread. What was he going to say? What could he say that would make any difference? He had rehearsed a dozen different ways to start the conversation, but now that he was here, his mind was blank. When he reached Dylan's apartment, the door was already slightly ajar. Ethan knocked gently before pushing it open and stepping inside. The apartment was small but neat, with minimalist furniture and walls lined with framed photos. Ethan's eyes scanned the room, taking in the little details: books on the shelf, a guitar leaning against the wall. It was a glimpse into Dylan's world, a world he had never been a part of. Dylan stood in the middle of the room, arms crossed, his expression guarded. He didn't say anything as Ethan entered, just watched him with those same cold eyes that had haunted Ethan since the moment they first met. "I wasn't sure you'd let me in," Ethan said after a moment, his voice breaking the silence. "I wasn't sure either," Dylan replied, his tone clipped. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure where to begin. "I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything," Ethan started, his words slow and deliberate. "I wasn't there. I wasn't a father to you. And for that, I'm sorry." Dylan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Ethan continued, "I made choices that I thought were right at the time, but looking back, I realize how wrong I was. I thought I was doing the best thing for everyone by focusing on my career, by staying away, but I see now that all I did was hurt the people I cared about the most." Dylan's arms remained crossed, but his eyes flickered with something, whether it was anger, sadness, or something else. Ethan couldn't tell. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I don't even expect you to want to know me, but I'm here, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn your trust." There was a long silence, so thick it was almost suffocating. Ethan stood there, waiting, unsure of how Dylan would respond. He half expected him to tell him to leave, to slam the door in his face, but instead, Dylan just stared at him, his expression unreadable. Finally, Dylan spoke, his voice low but sharp. "You think you can just walk in here after all these years and say sorry and that's it?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I know it's not that simple." "You don't know anything," Dylan shot back, his voice rising slightly. "You don't know what it was like growing up without you. You don't know the kind of person I am. You weren't there." "I know I wasn't there," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And that's something I'll regret for the rest of my life." Dylan turned away, running a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. Ethan watched him, his heart aching with the knowledge that he had caused this anger, this distance. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Ethan said quietly. "I'm asking for a chance to know you, to try to be part of your life if you'll let me." Dylan didn't turn around, but his shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of the conversation was wearing him down. Ethan stood there, waiting, hoping. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The silence in the apartment felt heavier than before, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of their conversation. Dylan still stood with his back to Ethan, his body tense and his fists clenched at his sides. Ethan could see the struggle playing out in his son's posture, the conflicting emotions, the anger, the confusion. "I don't know if I can do this," Dylan finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's heart sank. "I understand," he said softly. "And if you need time, I'll give you time. I don't want to push you into anything you're not ready for." Dylan let out a harsh laugh and turned to face him, his expression hard. "Time? What time? You've already missed 25 years. You can't just ask for more time now, like that's going to fix everything." Ethan flinched at the bitterness in Dylan's voice. He had expected this, but hearing it was still difficult. He opened his mouth to respond, but Dylan wasn't finished. "Where were you, huh?" Dylan asked, his voice rising with every word. "Where were you when I was a kid? When I asked Mom about my father and she had no answers? When I watched other kids at school with their dads, and I had to wonder why mine wasn't around?" Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He wanted to say something, anything, to ease the pain in Dylan's voice, but he knew that words wouldn't be enough. Dylan's eyes flashed with anger as he continued. Do you have any idea what that was like? Growing up wondering why you weren't good enough for your own father to stick around? Watching your mom work her ass off to raise me on her own, while you were off living your life, building your empire, like we didn't even exist. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, not out of anger, but out of frustration and guilt. He had thought about these things, late at night, in the quiet moments between meetings and deals. But hearing Dylan say it out loud made it all the more real, all the more devastating. I didn't know, Ethan said, his voice raw. I didn't know about you. If I had known... What? Dylan interrupted, his voice laced with disbelief. If you had known, what would you have done? You would have dropped everything and come back. Do you really expect me to believe that? Ethan felt a deep ache in his chest. I don't know what I would have done, he admitted. I can't change the past. I can't undo the decisions I made, but I'm here now, and I'm trying. Trying, Dylan spat, shaking his head. You think showing up now changes anything? You can't just show up and expect us to pick up where you left off, like it's some kind of second chance for you. I'm not asking for things to go back to the way they were, Ethan said, struggling to keep his voice steady. I know I can't undo the past. I just want to be part of your life now. I want to know you, Dylan. I want to make up for lost time, if you'll let me. Dylan stared at him for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and fury. Make up for lost time, he repeated, his voice full of bitterness. You think you can just show up and fix everything with a few apologies and some half-assed attempts to get to know me? You have no idea what you missed. I know I missed everything, Ethan said quietly, his heart aching with the weight of his son's words. I know I wasn't there for you, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I'm here now, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to try and be a part of your life. Dylan's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening again. You don't get it, do you? I don't need you. I've never needed you. I've been fine on my own, with Mom. We got by without you. So why should I let you back in now? Why should I give you a chance to mess things up again? Ethan felt the sting of Dylan's words, but he knew they came from a place of deep hurt, of wounds that had never fully healed. I know you don't need me, he said softly, but maybe I need you. Dylan's expression faltered for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before it hardened again. That's your problem, he said coldly, not mine. Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He stood there, his hands hanging at his sides, feeling more helpless than he ever had in his life. He had spent decades making decisions that affected the lives of thousands of people. But here, in this small apartment, he couldn't seem to find the right words to reach his own son. I'm sorry, Dylan, he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry for everything. Dylan looked away, his jaw clenched, his fists still tight at his sides. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I don't know if I can forgive you, Dylan finally said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. I don't know if I even want to. Ethan's heart sank, but he didn't push. He knew this wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. Dylan had every right to feel the way he did, and Ethan couldn't expect him to just let go of all that pain and resentment in one conversation. I understand, Ethan said softly. I'm not asking you to forgive me, I just want a chance to try. Dylan didn't respond. He stood there, his gaze focused on the floor, his shoulders tense with the weight of everything that had been said. Ethan didn't know what else to say. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure of whether to take a step forward or step back. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to walk away this time. I'll be here, Ethan said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." Dylan didn't look up, but Ethan saw the way his shoulders shifted, the subtle tension that seemed to ease just slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days that followed Ethan's confrontation with Dylan were long and heavy. He hadn't heard from his son since that day in the apartment, and the silence was deafening. Every time his phone buzzed, a flicker of hope ignited in his chest, only to be extinguished when it wasn't the message he was waiting for. He tried to focus on work, but his heart wasn't in it. Even the impending merger, which had once been the focal point of his life, felt insignificant compared to the storm brewing inside him. One evening, as Ethan sat in his office, staring blankly at the documents spread out in front of him, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Danielle. "We need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow?" Ethan's pulse quickened. He typed back a quick reply, confirming the time and place, and spent the rest of the night wondering what she wanted to talk about. Was it about Dylan? Had he said something to her about their meeting? The following day, Ethan arrived at the restaurant early, just as he had for the previous meetings. His nerves were frayed, and despite the calm exterior he maintained in business, this was different. This was personal, and it was messy in a way he wasn't used to handling. Danielle arrived on time, just as she always did. As she approached the table, Ethan noticed something different in her demeanor. She seemed more at ease than before, though her eyes still carried the weight of their shared history. "Thank you for coming," she said as she sat down, folding her hands in front of her. "Of course," Ethan replied, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. There was a pause as they both took a moment to settle into the conversation. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, but there was also a sense of familiarity, something that had never fully disappeared, even after all these years apart. "I wanted to talk to you about Dylan," Danielle began, her voice calm but serious. "He's been distant since your meeting. He hasn't said much, but I know he's struggling with everything that's happened." Ethan nodded, his chest tightening. "I understand," he said quietly. "I didn't expect him to forgive me overnight. I just want him to know that I'm here, that I'm willing to wait for him to come around." Danielle sighed, her gaze softening slightly. "I know you mean well, Ethan, but this isn't going to be easy. Dylan's angry. He's been angry for a long time, even if he hasn't always shown it. And now, with you back in the picture, all those feelings are coming to the surface." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of her words. "I don't blame him," he admitted. "I would feel the same way if I were in his shoes. I don't know how to reach him." Danielle looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. "It's not just about reaching him," she said softly. "It's about giving him space to process everything. He's spent his whole life without you, and now you're here, wanting to be part of his world. That's a lot for him to take in." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "I know," he said, "but I can't just walk away. Not again." Danielle's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a moment, Ethan saw a glimmer of the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. There was still pain there, but there was also something else. Maybe hope, maybe doubt. It was hard to tell. "I've been thinking a lot about us," Danielle said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "About everything that's happened." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this conversation to shift toward their past, but now that it had, he wasn't sure how to respond. "I know we can't go back to the way things were," Danielle continued, her gaze steady. "Too much has changed, and there's too much history between us. But part of me wonders, what if things had been different? What if you hadn't left?" Ethan felt a pang of regret. It was the same question that had haunted him for years. What if? What if he had chosen differently? What if he had stayed with her, built a life with her, and been the father Dylan deserved? "I've asked myself that question 1,000 times," Ethan admitted, his voice low. and I don't have a good answer. All I know is that I made the wrong choice." Danielle's lips pressed into a thin line, her emotions carefully guarded. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully forgive you for leaving," she said honestly. "But I've also realized that holding on to that anger doesn't help anyone. Not me, and certainly not Dylan." Ethan listened, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy," she continued, "but maybe, just maybe, there's a way forward, for all of us." Ethan looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "What are you saying?" he asked carefully, not wanting to misinterpret her words. Danielle hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her next sentence. "I'm saying that I'm willing to try," she said softly. "Not for us, not as a couple. That ship sailed a long time ago. But for Dylan, I'm willing to work with you, to try to help him heal. But it's going to take time." Ethan felt a surge of relief and hope. It wasn't the resolution he had once dreamed of, Danielle's love and forgiveness, but it was a start. It was a chance to rebuild, not as lovers, but as parents. And that was enough for now. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Danielle gave him a small, almost sad smile. "I know," she said, "but remember, this isn't just about you or me. This is about Dylan. He's the one who needs to heal." Ethan nodded, fully aware of the challenge ahead. "I'll do my best," he promised. Danielle stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. "We'll see," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'll talk to Dylan, but don't expect things to change overnight." Ethan watched as she left the restaurant, a mixture of hope and uncertainty settling in his chest. It wasn't the ending he had once imagined, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something good to come from all of this. The following weeks tested Ethan's patience in ways he hadn't anticipated. Despite Danielle's willingness to talk and slowly open the door to some kind of relationship between him and Dylan, things remained tense. Dylan still wasn't ready to speak to him, and Ethan knew better than to push. Every day that passed without hearing from his son weighed heavier on him, but Danielle's words echoed in his mind. This will take time. Ethan threw himself into work, using it as a distraction, but even that wasn't as fulfilling as it once had been. The upcoming merger, a massive deal that could elevate his company to even greater heights, required his full attention. Meetings stretched late into the night, with his board of directors pressing him for final decisions. But his heart wasn't in it. One evening, as Ethan sat in his office, reviewing the final documents for the merger, his phone buzzed. His heart leaped when he saw Danielle's name flash on the screen. "We talked. He's not ready yet, but he's thinking about it." It was a small update, but for Ethan, it was everything. Dylan was thinking about it. That meant there was still a chance, still hope that one day he might open the door to a relationship. Ethan closed his eyes, relief flooding through him. He had been waiting for something, anything, to show that his efforts weren't in vain. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the contract on his desk. The merger would solidify his company's position in the industry, cementing his legacy as one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. But suddenly, that didn't seem as important anymore. For the first time in his life, Ethan questioned whether he wanted this. He had always been driven by success, by the need to be the best. But now, with the possibility of reconnecting with Dylan hanging in the balance, it felt different. What good was all the success in the world if he didn't have the relationships that mattered most? The following day, Ethan walked into the boardroom for the final meeting on the merger. The room was filled with tension, the kind that only accompanies deals of this magnitude. His executives, the legal team, and the other company's representatives were all seated, waiting for him to speak. Ethan sat at the head of the table, the contract in front of him, waiting for his signature. He glanced around the room, taking in the eager faces of those who depended on this deal going through. His company had worked for months to make this happen. And now, all that was left was his approval. But as he stared at the document, pen in hand, something didn't feel right. His mind flashed back to Dylan, to the possibility of finally being a father, of being part of his son's life. And then he thought of what Danielle had said, about how this wasn't just about him. It was about Dylan, about the family he had missed out on. Ethan placed the pen down. "I can't sign this," he said, his voice steady but firm. The room fell silent, a wave of confusion rippling through the executives around the table. His lead advisor, Robert I, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Ethan, we're at the finish line here. This deal is monumental for the company. You can't just walk away." Ethan looked at him, knowing the weight of his decision. "I've spent my entire life chasing deals like this," he said quietly. "But it's cost me everything else. I can't do that anymore." Robert exchanged glances with the other board members, all of them equally shocked. "You're making a mistake," he said. "This merger will take our company to the next level. It's what you've been working toward for years." "I know," Ethan replied, his voice calm. "But I have something more important to focus on now. This deal, it doesn't mean what it used to." For a moment, the room was filled with tense silence. Robert opened his mouth to protest again, but Ethan stood, cutting him off. "This is my decision," he said, his tone final. "I'm stepping away from the deal." Without waiting for a response, Ethan walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind the astonished faces of his colleagues. As he made his way back to his office, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't easy. Walking away from a deal of this magnitude was something he never thought he'd do. But deep down, he knew it was the right choice. Back in his office, Ethan sat at his desk, staring out at the skyline of the city. He had spent years building this empire, sacrificing relationships along the way. And now, for the first time, he was sacrificing the business for the sake of those relationships. It was a different kind of sacrifice, one that felt far more personal, far more meaningful. He pulled out his phone and sent a message to Danielle. "I walked away from the merger. I'm focusing on what really matters now." A few minutes later, her response came. "I hope you're serious about that, because it's going to take more than one grand gesture to fix things with Dylan." Ethan smiled softly at her reply. He knew she was right. This was only the beginning. There would be no quick fixes, no easy solutions. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. He was ready to make up for lost time, no matter how long it took. It had been 2 weeks since Ethan walked away from the merger. The fallout had been significant. There were rumors swirling in the business world, questions from the press, and concern among his board members about the future of the company. But Ethan remained steadfast. He had made his choice, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't questioning it. Since then, he hadn't heard much from Dylan. Danielle had been in touch a few times, giving him brief updates, but it was clear that his son was still processing everything. Ethan knew better than to push. He had already made that mistake once. One evening, as Ethan sat in his apartment, flipping through old family photos he had managed to dig up, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw Dylan's name. His heart leaped into his throat. For a moment, he hesitated. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. But what would Dylan say? Was he ready to talk, to reconnect? Or was this just another step in a long, painful process? With a deep breath, Ethan opened the message. "Can we meet?" That was all it said, but it was enough. A surge of emotion washed over him. Relief, excitement, and a hint of fear. He quickly typed a reply, setting a time and place. They agreed to meet at a small cafe downtown, a neutral space where neither of them would feel overwhelmed. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the cafe early, as usual. He ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching people pass by on the busy streets outside. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What would Dylan say? Would he be open to reconciliation? Or was this meeting simply to lay down boundaries? Ethan knew he couldn't expect too much too soon, but the fact that Dylan had reached out at all gave him hope. When Dylan walked through the door, Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. His son looked different this time, less guarded, though still cautious. There was no denying the tension between them, but there was also something else, a willingness, maybe even a curiosity, that hadn't been there before. "Hey," Dylan said as he approached the table. Ethan stood up, offering a small, tentative smile. "Hey." They sat down, the silence stretching out for a few moments before Dylan finally spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about wanting to get to know me." Ethan nodded, his throat tight with anticipation. "I meant every word," he said softly. "I don't want to force anything, but I'm here, whenever you're ready." Dylan stared down at his coffee, his fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to feel," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I've spent my whole life wondering why you weren't there, and now you are, but it's like I don't even know you." Ethan's heart ached at the honesty in Dylan's words. He had spent years preparing for this moment, imagining how it might go, but nothing could have prepared him for the rawness of the conversation. "I know," Ethan said, his voice low, "and I don't expect you to feel anything right away. This isn't something that can be fixed overnight." Dylan nodded, still staring at his coffee. "I guess I'm just confused. Part of me wants to hate you for not being there. But another part of me wants to know who you are. It's like I'm stuck between two things." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to keep his own emotions in check. "You have every right to feel that way," he said. "I don't blame you for being angry. I'd feel the same way if I were in your shoes." Dylan finally looked up, his eyes searching Ethan's face for something, maybe understanding, maybe forgiveness. "I'm not sure how to move forward," he admitted, "but I think I want to try." Ethan's heart swelled with hope. "That's all I'm asking for," he said quietly. "Just a chance to try. I'm not perfect, and I know I've made a lot of mistakes, but I want to be part of your life. If you'll let me." For the first time, a small, tentative smile appeared on Dylan's face. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "I don't know what that looks like yet," he said, "but I guess we'll figure it out." Ethan nodded, his own smile growing. "We will, one step at a time." The rest of their conversation was lighter, though still careful. They talked about Dylan's life, his work, his friends, his hobbies. Ethan listened intently, absorbing every detail, trying to piece together the life he had missed. He didn't push, didn't pry. He let Dylan guide the conversation, and slowly, the tension between them began to ease. After an hour, Dylan glanced at his watch and stood up. "I should get going," he said, though his tone wasn't as distant as it had been when they first met. Ethan stood as well, feeling a mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a lingering sadness for all the time they had lost. But there was also hope that they could rebuild something, no matter how long it took. "Thanks for meeting with me," Dylan said, his voice softer than before. "Thank you," Ethan replied, his voice full of sincerity. "For giving me a chance." Dylan gave a small nod and turned to leave. Ethan watched as his son walked out of the cafe, a sense of peace settling over him. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was more than he could have hoped for. It was a beginning. As Ethan left the cafe, he felt lighter than he had in years. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more difficult conversations, more moments of tension. But he was willing to face all of it. For the first time in his life, he wasn't driven by ambition or success. He was driven by something far more important: family. That evening, as Ethan sat in his apartment, his phone buzzed. It was another message from Danielle. "He told me about your meeting. He said he's willing to try." "That's a big step, Ethan." Ethan smiled, his chest swelling with a sense of accomplishment that no business deal could ever match. "I know. It's the best step I've ever taken.